Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about Turkey. They see Erdogan's recent diplomatic moves, the peace talks he's hosting, the defense deals he's signing, and they assume it's typical regional posturing. Just another middle power trying to punch above its weight, making noise but ultimately constrained by NATO membership and geographic reality. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? Turkey's been a reliable NATO ally for 70 years. Its economy depends on Western trade, and its military uses American hardware. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how regional power transitions actually work. What if Turkey isn't posturing at all? What if Ankara has been methodically executing a coherent strategic plan for 5 years, and we're only now seeing the architecture become visible because the foundation is already complete? There is one single pattern that explains everything Turkey has done since 2019. The Syria withdrawal, the Libya intervention, the Azerbaijan support, the Somalia base, the mediation between Russia and Ukraine, the rapprochement with Egypt and UAE, the defense industry explosion, every single move. Most people never connect these dots. And that's not an accident, because when you understand what Turkey is actually building, you realize the Middle East you think you know is already gone. Think about what happens when a regional power decides it no longer needs permission. Not through dramatic confrontation, not by leaving alliances or burning bridges, but through patient construction of parallel architecture that makes the old system increasingly irrelevant. That's not revolution, that's replacement. And Turkey has been building that parallel architecture systematically in plain sight, while everyone focused on the drama instead of the structure. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what American regional dominance actually represents. It's not primarily military bases or carrier groups, though those matter. It's something more fundamental. It's the ability to determine which conflicts get resolved and which ones stay frozen, which governments receive support and which ones get isolated, which trade routes stay open and which ones get sanctioned. That's the real architecture of regional hegemony. And here's the thing people miss. That architecture requires constant maintenance. You can't just establish it once and assume it persists. You have to keep demonstrating that you're willing to use force, that you'll back your allies reliably, that opposing you costs more than accommodating you. The moment that demonstration becomes inconsistent, the moment your red lines become suggestions, the entire structure begins to erode. Now, standard international relations theory tells you that when hegemonic power declines, you get chaos, a multipolar free-for-all where everyone scrambles for advantage and regional stability collapses. But there's another pattern from history, one that's less discussed but more relevant here. Sometimes, when a hegemon withdraws, a prepared regional power can step into the vacuum so smoothly that the transition barely registers as transition. The local population might not even notice that the architecture changed, only that different actors now occupy the key nodes. Think about how Britain withdrew from the Mediterranean after World War II. The Royal Navy had dominated those waters for a century. Every regional power oriented their strategy around British presence. Trade routes, naval bases, diplomatic protocols, all of it structured around London's preeminence. When Britain could no longer sustain that position, the United States didn't confront British power directly. Washington simply began providing the same services, security guarantees, diplomatic mediation, economic integration, but more reliably and at greater scale. By the time the transition completed, the regional system barely noticed the substitution. The architecture persisted even as the operator changed. That's the framework we need to apply here. Turkey isn't trying to overthrow American regional dominance through confrontation. Ankara is building parallel capacity to provide the same services that Washington has provided for decades, but with crucial advantages. Geographic proximity that makes sustained commitment more credible, cultural and religious familiarity that makes mediation more acceptable, economic integration that doesn't come with democracy, promotion, conditionality, and most importantly, a demonstrated willingness to use force when necessary without the domestic political constraints that now paralyze American intervention. This is substitution theory. The idea that regional power transitions happen not through direct challenge, but through parallel construction that eventually makes the original power structure obsolete. The key insight is that the replacement doesn't need to match the original hegemon's total capabilities. It only needs to provide the specific services that regional actors actually value, delivered more consistently and at lower political cost. Once that parallel system reaches critical mass, the old architecture becomes vestigial. It might persist formally, but it no longer determines outcomes. Let me walk you through exactly how Turkey has been building this parallel architecture, because the precision is actually remarkable. Start in 2019. Turkey launches Operation Peace Spring into northern Syria against US-backed Kurdish forces. On the surface, it looks like tactical border security, protecting against PKK infiltration, but strategically, it establishes something more significant. Turkey demonstrates it will use military force in direct contradiction to American preferences when core interests are at stake, and it will absorb the diplomatic and economic costs without reversing course. That's the first pillar, credible willingness to use force independently. 6 months later, Turkey intervenes in Libya's civil war, sending military advisors, drone systems, and Syrian mercenaries to support the Tripoli government against Khalifa Haftar's forces, which were backed by Egypt, UAE, Russia, and France. Turkey wasn't responding to an immediate threat here. Libya is 200 kilometers from Turkish territory. This was strategic positioning. By preventing Haftar's victory, Ankara secured access to Libyan energy reserves, established military presence on the Mediterranean southern shore, and demonstrated capacity to project power across maritime space. More importantly, Turkey proved it could intervene effectively in conflicts where all major regional and external powers opposed its position, and win anyway. Now layer on top of that the Azerbaijan intervention in 2020, when war erupted between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey provided decisive military support through drone technology, intelligence sharing, and strategic planning. The result was total Azerbaijani victory in 44 days, reshaping a conflict that had been frozen since 1994. But notice what Turkey gained beyond the strategic alliance. It demonstrated that its defense industry produces systems that win wars, not just fill export quotas. Those TB2 Bayraktar drones became global commodities overnight. Indonesia, Morocco, Poland, Ukraine, Ethiopia, dozens of countries suddenly wanted Turkish military technology because it had proven lethality in real combat conditions. Here's where the architecture becomes visible. By 2021, Turkey is simultaneously hosting Afghan peace talks, mediating between Somalia and Kenya, negotiating grain corridor agreements between Russia and Ukraine, facilitating Saudi-Iranian rapprochement discussions, and maintaining dialogue channels with both Israel and Hamas. Think about what that represents. Every one of those mediation efforts requires that all parties trust Turkey enough to engage in good faith. You can't mediate between adversaries if either side thinks you're aligned with their opponent. Turkey has positioned itself as acceptable interlocutor to Sunni Gulf monarchies and Shia Iran, to NATO members and Russia, to Israel and Palestinian factions, to Western-backed governments and Islamist movements. That's not ideological consistency. That's strategic flexibility calibrated to maximum mediator utility. The economic dimension reinforces the same pattern. Turkey's trade with Africa increased 400% between 2003 and 2020, reaching $25 billion annually. Turkish construction firms have built $75 billion in infrastructure projects across the Middle East and North Africa since 2003. Turkish Airlines flies to more African destinations than any other carrier, connecting 60 cities across the continent to Istanbul's hub. These aren't vanity projects. This is systematic economic integration that creates dependencies and leverage. When Turkish firms build your airport, your power grid, your telecommunications network, you develop structural interest in maintaining positive relations with Ankara. Now add the defense industry expansion. In 2002, Turkey imported 80% of its military equipment. By 2023, that figure reversed. Turkey now produces 80% of its defense needs domestically and exports $6 billion annually in military systems. That's not just economic development. That's strategic autonomy. When your military depends on American F-35s that can be sanctioned away, you negotiate within constraints. When you produce your own drones, armored vehicles, naval vessels, and air defense systems, those constraints evaporate. Turkey can now promise military partnerships without worrying that Washington will veto the arms transfers. Let me give you a concrete scenario that shows how this works in practice. Imagine a regional conflict erupts, something like renewed tensions between Gulf states and Iran over Strait of Hormuz access. Under the traditional architecture, all parties would look to Washington for mediation and security guarantees. The United States would deploy carrier groups, facilitate negotiations, and ultimately broker some arrangement that maintains shipping access without military escalation. But now think about how that plays out in 2024. Washington is distracted by Ukraine, by Taiwan, by domestic political paralysis over military commitments. The response is slow, ambiguous, hedged with conditions about burden sharing and alliance contributions. Turkey, meanwhile, can respond within 48 hours. Ankara has relationships with Tehran, with Riyadh, with Abu Dhabi, with Baghdad. Turkish naval vessels can deploy to the Gulf from Aksaz naval base. Turkish diplomats can shuttle between capitals with credible neutrality. And critically, Turkey can offer something the United States increasingly cannot: solutions that don't require regime change, democracy promotion, or integration into Western security architecture. Just practical arrangements that keep energy flowing and conflicts contained. That scenario isn't hypothetical. It's exactly what happened with the Ukraine grain corridor negotiations in 2022. Russia and Ukraine couldn't negotiate directly. The United States couldn't broker a deal because Russia refused American mediation. The UN had no enforcement capacity. Turkey stepped in, negotiated the arrangement, provided the monitoring infrastructure, and maintained the corridor for over a year. It wasn't perfect, and it eventually collapsed. But for crucial months, Turkish mediation prevented global food crisis, while every other diplomatic channel had failed. Or take the recent Turkey-Egypt rapprochement after a decade of hostility. Egypt under Sisi and Turkey under Erdogan had been regional rivals, backing opposite sides in Libya, supporting competing factions in Gaza, pursuing contradictory visions for regional order. But in 2021, diplomatic engagement resumed. By 2023, trade had recovered, ambassadors had returned, and military cooperation discussions had begun. What changed? Both countries recognized that American security guarantees had become unreliable and that unilateral action was costly. Turkish mediation and economic integration offered more predictable framework than waiting for American leadership that might never arrive. The Somalia dimension reveals the same pattern. Turkey has invested over $1 billion in Somalia since 2011, building roads, hospitals, schools, the international airport, the seaport. Turkish military trainers operate the largest foreign base in Mogadishu, preparing Somali forces for counter-terrorism operations. Turkish Airlines provides the only reliable international connection. When Somalia needs diplomatic support at the UN or African Union, Ankara provides it. The relationship isn't exploitative extraction. It's sustained capacity building that creates genuine partnership. And critically, it demonstrates that Turkey can maintain long-term commitments in the most challenging security environments, something that distinguishes sustained regional power from opportunistic intervention. Now, here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable for analysts in Washington. Add to all of this something that makes the Turkish substitution particularly significant: the demographic and cultural dimension. Turkey is Muslim-majority country with Ottoman historical memory that shapes how regional populations perceive Turkish engagement. When Turkish humanitarian organizations provide disaster relief, when Turkish hospitals treat refugees, when Turkish cultural products dominate regional entertainment markets, it activates different psychological frameworks than Western engagement does. There's no colonial legacy to overcome, no civilizational clash narrative to navigate, no automatic suspicion of ulterior motives. I'm not saying regional populations automatically prefer Turkish leadership over American. That's too simple. But there is reduced friction. Turkish involvement doesn't trigger the same sovereignty concerns or nationalist resistance that American presence often generates. In practical terms, that means Turkish mediation faces lower barriers to acceptance, Turkish economic integration encounters less political opposition, and Turkish military presence provokes less domestic backlash in partner countries. Those aren't decisive advantages in themselves, but they compound with everything else Turkey has built to create substitution capacity that no other regional actor can match. The implications of this pattern cascade in ways that most analysis completely misses. Start with the immediate tactical level. If Turkey successfully positions itself as indispensable mediator for regional conflicts, then every crisis becomes opportunity to expand Turkish influence. The more often Ankara successfully brokers agreements that Washington couldn't or wouldn't negotiate, the more regional actors default to Turkish channels when problems emerge. That creates self-reinforcing cycle where mediation success generates additional mediation opportunities, which generate additional success, which cements Turkey's position as essential broker. Now extend that to the regional systemic level. If Turkey becomes the default mediator, then the entire structure of regional security begins to reorganize around Ankara rather than Washington. Alliance patterns shift. Countries that previously oriented their foreign policy toward American preferences start calibrating toward Turkish interests instead, not because Turkey demands it, but because that's where effective problem-solving now happens. Qatar's massive investments in Turkey, Azerbaijan's strategic partnership, Somalia's dependency, Libya's government of national unity's survival, all of these relationships reflect recognition that Turkish support delivers results in ways that American backing increasingly does not. The economic transmission mechanism matters enormously here. As American sanctions become routine tool of foreign policy, regional actors face constant risk that economic relationships with Washington will collapse over political disputes. Turkey offers alternative integration path. Turkish banks can process transactions that American sanctions block. Turkish construction firms can execute projects that Western companies won't risk. Turkish military exports can replace American systems that come with congressional approval requirements. This isn't complete sanctions evasion. Turkey remains integrated into Western financial systems, but it's enough flexibility to reduce the costs of American displeasure from catastrophic to manageable. Project this forward to the global economic level, and you see something more troubling for Washington. If multiple regional powers simultaneously develop substitution capacity, providing security, mediation, and economic integration services that used to require American involvement, then the entire architecture of dollar dominance starts to face pressure. Not immediate collapse, nothing that dramatic, but erosion. Countries need fewer dollar reserves if their trade increasingly runs through alternative channels. They need less exposure to American financial systems if Turkish, Chinese, or Gulf financing can meet their development needs. The system doesn't break overnight. It just becomes progressively less essential. Now we get to the structural order implications, and this is where most analysis completely fails. The post-1945 international system was built on assumption that regional security requires hegemonic guarantor, and that only the United States possesses both capability and will to provide that service globally. If Turkey demonstrates that regional powers can provide equivalent services within their own neighborhoods and do so more effectively than distant hegemons, then the entire logic of American global military presence gets called into question. Not by adversaries making that argument, but by allies recognizing they have alternative options. Think about the NATO implications specifically. Turkey has been a problematic ally for years, buying Russian S-400 systems, threatening military action against fellow members, obstructing expansion, using refugees as diplomatic leverage. Standard analysis says this proves Turkey is an unreliable partner trending toward authoritarian isolation. But what if the pattern means something else? What if Turkey is methodically demonstrating that it can pursue independent regional strategy while maintaining nominal alliance membership, and that Washington will absorb the friction rather than risk losing access to Turkish geography entirely? If that's the correct interpretation, then Turkey isn't becoming less Western. Turkey is becoming post-Western, still integrated into Western institutions when advantageous, still cooperating on shared interests, but no longer constrained by the assumption that American leadership is prerequisite for regional security or economic development. Other powers are watching that closely. Saudi Arabia's partial pivot toward China, UAE's balancing strategy, Egypt's multi-alignment approach, all of these reflect similar calculations. That exclusive alignment with Washington no longer offers optimal returns. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not chaotic Turkish foreign policy lurching between contradictory positions. What you see is very deliberate architecture designed to position Turkey as indispensable regional power, precisely as American commitment becomes structurally unreliable. This isn't opportunistic exploitation of temporary American distraction. This is systematic response to permanent shift in the global distribution of power and attention. The foundation is geographic. Turkey sits at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, controlling access to the Black Sea, bordering 8 countries within short flight distance of 1.5 billion people. That geography made Turkey strategically vital during the Cold War because it blocked Soviet expansion. That same geography makes Turkey essential now because it provides access to every regional conflict zone, every energy transit route, every migration corridor. The geography didn't change. What changed is Turkey's willingness to leverage that geography for independent strategic purposes, rather than offering it as passive platform for American power projection. The real question is not whether Turkey has the capability to replace American regional dominance. Ankara clearly cannot match American global military power or economic scale. The question is whether Turkey can provide enough of the services that regional actors actually value: mediation, security assistance, economic integration, diplomatic recognition, that American involvement becomes optional rather than essential. And on that metric, the evidence points in uncomfortable direction. Turkey is already the mediator of choice for conflicts where American involvement is impossible. Turkey is already the military partner of choice for countries that American sanctions exclude. Turkey is already the economic integrator of choice for regions where Western investment won't go. These aren't separate dynamics happening in parallel. They interact. Economic integration creates dependencies that make Turkish mediation more acceptable. Successful mediation generates demand for Turkish military systems. Military partnerships require economic relationships to sustain them. The cycle reinforces itself with every iteration, and critically, it operates whether or not anyone in Washington is paying attention. This isn't challenge that requires American response to succeed. It's substitution that advances through American absence. I want to be honest with you about something. This analysis doesn't mean American regional influence collapses next year or even next decade. What it means is that the conditions that made American regional dominance automatic and unquestioned are eroding faster than the conditions that would preserve it. Turkey isn't unique in recognizing this. Saudi Arabia sees it, UAE sees it, Egypt sees it. They're all building partial autonomy, all developing alternative relationships, all hedging against American unreliability. Turkey is just further along the curve because it started earlier and executed more systematically. The next time you hear about Turkish mediation efforts or defense exports or economic deals in Africa, try holding all of these things together in the same frame, because they're not separate stories. They're different angles on the same story. The story of what regional order looks like when hegemonic guarantor becomes optional rather than essential. That transition has historical precedent. It happened when Britain withdrew from the Mediterranean, when France withdrew from Africa, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The pattern is structural, not accidental. And right now, the conditions for that transition in the Middle East are assembling with remarkable speed. Whether anyone in Washington notices is becoming less relevant with every passing year.